On this video, I'm going to speak about why I didn't buy a car until after I was 30 and why I don't still own a house and why I think it's one of the best decisions I made. Okay everyone, so if you're an expat or a high net wealth individual, go over to infuriated.com and see what I can offer. Now on today's video, I'm going to talk about a car and a house. Now, many of my clients say to me, things like, do you own a house, do you own a car, blah, blah, blah. And of course, especially for those clients who are from countries where this is very culturally important, a lot of them are quite surprised to know that I didn't own these things until later on. In the case of a house, I still don't own a house. And obviously people who have read my content or watched my content aren't so surprised if they've read it in detail. But here's the bottom line, right? I mean, number one, obviously my lifestyle has been very much an expat lifestyle. I moved overseas at quite a young age, and that makes it easier to say, well, actually it doesn't make sense to buy. It makes sense to rent, and buying a car becomes a hassle. I can remember, for example, when I lived in Shanghai, the subway or the metro, underground, whatever you want to call it, cost like $50, whereas buying a house and a car was even more expensive than back home. And so there was no incentive, right? It was ridiculous. Taking the subway or the public transport would cost a tenth or even maybe a 30th of what it did back home. Buying a car would cost more, and then you would have to sell it. But I think there's a wider point here. And when I look at my network, one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make is they do what society wants them to do. So they think, okay, well, it's the adult thing to do, to buy a house, to buy a car, to get married at this age or whatever. But in reality, you should only do it if it makes sense. Now, obviously, if you're living in a small town where, for example, buying is cheaper than renting and there's no good public transport, then you absolutely should probably buy a house and a car, right? But by the same token, if you're living, say, in London, or you're working at home and you don't have kids, then guess what? Probably either not buying a car or just buying a car and occasionally using it for like longer trips might make more sense than buying a car. It just depends. But what I would never do is I would never define yourself based on society's expectations. I know countless people who don't own a house, who don't own a car, who are multi-millionaires. I even know some people who have never learned to drive who are multi-millionaires. I know other people who look quote unquote rich. They have big cars, big fancy houses, but many of them are struggling with the repayments. Some of them are making a lot of money in income, but they actually have very little in terms of disposable income and security and wealth. Because if you think about it, if your salary is coming in and you're in a high tax country, 30 to 50%, if not more, is indirectly and directly being taken out in taxes. More if you're earning a lot. And then if on day one, the mortgage payment is coming out and the car payment is coming out, that doesn't leave you much to invest, right? It doesn't leave you much to build up liquid wealth through the stock market or indeed through a private business. So actually, most of the wealthy people I know have either started their own business and or invested privately long term, and or they have got wealthy in real estate, but only by focusing on being a professional real estate investor. What I mean by that is buy to let. During the heyday of the 1990s, early to mid 2000s, it was possible to leverage yourself with loads of buy to let properties. It's become harder now, as I've said on many of my videos. But the point is, I know hardly anyone. In fact, I think I literally don't know anyone who has managed to get truly wealthy by seeing their primary residence go up really high. Yes, I know plenty of people who have, bought a house in the 1970s and now it's worth millions and they feel like they're rich, but essentially they're house poor. In other words, on paper it looks like they're rich, but unless they sell and downsize, it's essentially just paper wealth, right? So actually, one of the big things I would say is that when people are young, late teens, early 20s, even up to like late 20s, I actually think if possible it makes sense not to drive a lot. But driving's okay, it doesn't always cost that much money, but especially don't buy a house until you're ready, until you're financially ready. And actually investing more money into yourself, into financial investments, into businesses, into reading, that makes a lot more sense than really kind of having yourself bogged down by payments. I mean, for me personally, I actually think there's a chance I wouldn't have made it if I would have had these payments, because if I would have got a house and a car as soon as I could have afforded it, there's a chance that basically things would have gone wrong, because I would have bought maybe in my mid-20s when my income was kind of up and down and it wasn't like now. And there's a chance, especially during those bad moments in business, maybe I would have been weighed down by those kind of fixed payments that had to be paid every single month. So when it comes to things like this, I'm not saying don't buy a car. I'm not some kind of radical environmentalist or something like that. I'm not saying don't buy a house in all circumstances. I'm merely saying that it has to be well thought out. And in certain respects, you have to think about all the indirect costs, right? If you're setting up a business and you're spending 10 grand even on a part-time car, and you're spending a few $100s a month, it doesn't sound like a lot maybe, but it actually is a lot compared to what you could do with that money investing into your business, or indeed investing into other things. So people have to look at this holistically. How can I help you? In two ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfired.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.